Before we start today's show, I'd like to welcome our newest FreshEd members, Amy Stambach and Tian Renxiang. Thank you so much for your support. If you think FreshEd is a valuable educational resource and want to join our growing community, please sign up at freshedpodcast.com. This is FreshEd, a weekly podcast that makes complex ideas in educational research easily understood. I'm your host, Will Brehm. Today we unpack education alternatives to reimagine education for just futures. My guests are Frank Adamson and Anne Spreen.
My point is that things that start as movements can become systemic. And it's our job to envision the types of movements and alternatives that are going to ensure future generations' capacity for life on the planet. Because that is what the existential stake is right now.
You know, you can't change a school by edict, saying this is what you're going to do. It's by showing people and giving people examples and bringing people together where they can kind of think and learn and see that other ways are possible. And it's generative. And I think that's the reason why we put together this volume.
Frank Adamson is Associate Professor of Education Leadership and Policy Studies at California State University, Sacramento. Anne Spreen is a Professor of International Education at New York University. They were on the co-editorial team for the NORRAG Special Issue entitled Education for Societal Transformation, Alternatives for a Just Future. They are also members of the Alternative Project, which I should mention I was a part of at its inception. Frank Adamson and Anne Spreen, welcome to FreshEd.
Thanks, Will. We're delighted to be here.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me here, Will.
So in your editorial introduction to the special issue that you write that we need educational alternatives to current dominant thinking and practices. So I want to kind of start by outlining what you mean by current dominant thinking and practices in education. What are these?
Sure. Thanks, Will. And what's going on currently is a great starting point. So around the world, and especially in places like the United States, but which also supports its policy, we've seen education reconfigured through the specific ideological lens of neoliberalism. So what is neoliberalism? It's an economic term that originates from liberalism, and it prioritizes individual liberty, free markets, and limited government. And then neoliberalism expands on free market principles across all of our sectors, primarily lately through privatization. So what does this mean for what's going on in schools? Schools then become organized around competition, around school choice, efficiency, standardized testing, and really at a basic level, human capital formation. What does that mean? Put simply, education is framed as a means to produce labor for the market, rather than as a site for democracy, solidarity, and human flourishing. And so let's contrast the neoliberal vision with the vision for education from the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, which says that education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality. Right? That doesn't sound like a call for more testing. And this neoliberal paradigm didn't emerge by accident. It reflects wider structures of capitalism, patriarchy, racism, ableism, and coloniality that shape so much of our societies and institutions. They determine what questions we can ask, the metrics we're using, and even the legitimacy of knowledge itself. And finally, I would say that the neoliberal paradigm is now increasingly intertwined with authoritarianism. We're seeing censorship of curriculum, attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, restrictions on teacher autonomy, and direct attacks on marginalized groups worldwide. So in many ways, neoliberalism is kind of the infrastructure and authoritarianism is the enforcement. That's our current situation.
So just to add, the system is rooted in a deeper mythology. And I think, we've been told poverty is inevitable, that inequality is acceptable, even though inequality and the gaps between the rich and the poor today are absolutely obscene. So we've been told that development is this benevolent global project, when in reality, it's functioned as a lie that serves the wealthy and the powerful. So, education's been folded into this mythology. It reproduces social hierarchies under the pretense of meritocracy. So in the NORRAG introduction, we discuss how these systems engineer profound inequities that ultimately threaten life on the planet. So the dominant paradigm doesn't just fail to address our crises. It actually produces these crises. I've seen with so many of my students over the last several decades that neoliberal ideology has become so rooted and entrenched in our public consciousness. It's the way we think about education as centered on competition, choice, standardized testing, efficiency, human capital metrics. All of this turns higher education into labor market training, and it embeds these assumptions into the fabric of K-12 education through things like sorting, tracking, and different research allocations. So these policies align with this capitalist hegemony, or what some have called the new oligarchies, right? Supranational corporations, private contractors, corporate philanthropies who shape education, and other agendas around profit, market, rate of return analysis, rather than education for democracy or justice. And as we've seen with Trump's Project 2025, this paradigm is tightened by authoritarian political projects. So, as Frank mentioned, curriculum censorships, attacks on DEI, policing of teacher autonomy, gag rules for teachers, and attacks on unions, and this parents' rights movement, these are all used as a wedge to dismantle public schooling. And authoritarian populism forces these patriotic and anti-woke instructional mandates that aim to prevent things like critical thinking and instead ensure ideological conformity, hollowing out the public purpose of education and ideas about democratic citizenship. So globally, we also have neoliberal and authoritarian forces converging, and these tend to promote things like privatization as the only solution to our public sector problems. So this model is really contradicting what we're proposing in TAP and in this special issue, where education is a tool or can be a tool for societal transformation instead of weaponizing schooling in service of social control.
So I just want to sort of get clear on the argument here in many ways is that there's neoliberalism, which obviously has a rather long history and different forms and formations in different places and times. But there's also this sort of, for lack of a better word, rise of contemporary authoritarianism around the world. And you're sort of saying these things are kind of coming together in this particular moment that makes it kind of essential that we begin to think in alternative ways. So it seems like you're saying that there's something about this current moment that makes it important to challenge some of this dominant thinking, even if some of this dominant thinking has had a longer history in and of itself.
Yes, absolutely. I think this moment is more urgent than ever. We're facing an existential polycrisis, which that means multiple crises at the same time. You've got authoritarianism rising globally. We've got wars, displacement, racism, and inequality escalating. We've got pandemics exposing the fragility of our systems. And then Noam Chomsky has identified two existential threats: nuclear annihilation and climate catastrophe. And by existential, we mean crises that actually threaten the entire species or multiple species and life on the planet. And so regarding the second threat, climate, the scientists are telling us that we are on the brink of irreversible ecological tipping points. Climate change requires immediate transformation. And I've actually changed my entire research agenda from education privatization to the climate crisis, because that's how dire I think our situation is. Just as a brief aside, because most people don't actually know this level of detail of about the climate, but in the chapter in this volume with Michael Gibbons, we talk about the carbon budget that we have right now of about 400 gigatons to stay within 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming, and 1,200 gigatons of a total carbon budget to stay under 2 degrees. Right now, we're on a path to 3.5 degrees. And in 2012, Bill McKibben estimated that we got 2,800 gigatons of carbon on the market. So the carbon we're burning or planning to burn is at least 5 times more than our budget. Right now, we use about 38 gigatons a year, which means that we're going to hit that first budget number in around 10 years. We're just in time for the Winter Olympics in Utah. And I'm using that as an example to emphasize the point that this is not a distant, far-off future. An eighth of Los Angeles burned in January. This is happening right now. And so in the introduction to the volume, we clearly say we can't postpone transformation to the next generation. This moment is both dangerous, but it's also generative. society is unraveling and at the same time opening space for radically reimagined education and general futures. And we've got to reimagine education because the world that was designed for it no longer exists. And we can.
I also think we've reached a moral crossroads right now. Look at the global political response to the genocide in Gaza and Sudan, and that the world watched in real time on their cell phones. So, we have a moral responsibility to build new values, institutions, and education systems capable of sustaining life, not destroying it. So violence, racism, and patriarchy are not inherent to humans. It's the result of toxic environments and systems that are built on extraction, racial capitalism, and domination. And globally, the rise of nativist, patriarchal, and xenophobic populism shows that fascism is no longer a theoretical issue. It's advancing. All around the world, we've seen that democracy is beginning to fail. Representative systems have given us the best governments that money can buy, and authoritarian movements exploit fear and division to take control of different institutions, including education. Authoritarianism seizes on this inability to intensify nativism, fear, and social fragmentation, using education as this battleground for populist identity politics. The current political movement in the U.S. specifically shows how fragile democracy is, and it makes education for solidarity, critical thinking, and civic courage all the more vital for us right now. In another vein, technology and AI both accelerate risk and offer little help in solving this polycrisis that Frank is talking about. They often deepen surveillance and inequality, and many people look for tech to solve all these problems, but it's not. It's really not going to do that. And education has to be aligned with these struggles and not the forces that seek to suppress them. At the same time, I think it's important that history shows us change is possible. We had the abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement, indigenous and Dalit movements, women's suffrage, Black Lives Matter, the landless workers movement in Brazil, and we've seen many uprisings of hope around the world. And, we put this NORRAG book together to lay out many of these examples so people could look to other futures.
And maybe that's what we should turn to at this point in the conversation. You're really focusing here on alternatives. And I guess the question is, what even is an alternative? Like, how do we begin to understand an alternative? Because in many ways, this changing of education to suit all the different isms that you're bringing up, in a way, is an alternative, right? Like, it might not be the alternative that we agree with, but it certainly is different and is gaining steam. So, how are you beginning to understand what alternatives mean?
So I think what we mean is non-reformist reforms. So changes that transform the underlying structures rather than tweak existing systems. And, years ago, nobody was talking about structural inequalities and structural systems, and we were tweaking around the edges. So alternatives are non-reformist reforms that challenge these underlying oppressive structures rather than operate within them. And they emphasize things like participation, radical democracy, cooperation and not competition, as we spoke about before, solidarity with workers, migrants, indigenous nations, social movements, across geographic spaces, working across identities, working across species, ecological reverence, regenerative relationships with the land, thinking about arts and imagination, things that capture the foundations of human possibility, things that are essential for envisioning or prefiguring new futures. It's also about well-being and buen vivir, the idea of social progress as community and collective flourishing rather than measuring it as GDP. These aren't abstract principles. They're rooted in actual communities and movements that are occurring all around the world. These alternatives reject the lie of development and the lie of economics as science and the idea that capitalism's metrics like efficiency have meaning. Really, they're grounded in the recognition that publicly provided services like education, healthcare, water, energy, housing, and even human rights are not commodities. These alternatives push towards policies that support transformation, like something like a universal basic income or universal health care or jobs and livelihood guarantees or 4-day work weeks or job sharing and other systems that, basically prioritize human and planetary well-being. these are alternatives that foster work that's fulfilling and not alienating for people.
When you get into the field of education in particular, education has to be transformed to meet the challenges we just laid out to meet this poly crisis. And so what does that mean? It needs to be participatory. It needs to be basically Freirean. And so we're replacing the banking concept of filling the student with information with a dialogical approach that engages students in their own process of developing knowledge and meaning making. We've got to have critical thinking and higher order thinking. We've got to incorporate different concepts into the curriculum, like peace. Note that the third word of our special interest group is militarism, and we're talking about authoritarianism. So we need to get serious about peace, creativity, love, compassion, empathy, solidarity, courage, resilience, humility. These are things that we need in our education systems that are not on your, standardized math test. And these alternatives already do exist. And that's really the main driver behind our volume and the Alternatives Project, or TAP, in general. So we see them in the landless workers movements, in the MST in Brazil, in the citizen schools in Brazil, in the Bacheloratas Populares in Argentina. You have arts-based peace pedagogies in Honduras and Uganda. You have ecoversities and non-formal learning networks that are happening everywhere. And a lot of these are coming out of ancestral or indigenous knowledge systems. It's like a fancy way for saying people that have lived in harmony with the earth for thousands of years and know that we can't overconsume our way out of this issue, right? And so these alternatives are thriving because people are organizing them collectively. They're not rarely at this moment initiated by the state or systemically. They're really communities, resisting injustice that are creating alternatives. And they don't have to be, as I said, they don't have to be new, right? They can be indigenous, they could be feminist, spiritual traditions, all of which have been tried. Capitalism and neoliberalism have really tried to erase in the name of consumption and profit. And fundamentally, what makes these alternatives transformative is that they challenge the structures of capitalism, patriarchy, racism, coloniality. And these alternatives create new values, new practices, and new relationships.
It seems to me that the big sticking point here is, yes, there's all these alternatives that exist, but it does sound like a lot of them are outside of the state. And the very scale of these issues and problems in the poly crisis that you are articulating seem to require both the state's involvement to make these alternatives widespread and commonplace, but also at the international level where multiple states are working together in, with these common values, as Frank is sort of talking about. And it seems to me like that's a real sticking point. Like, how do states change to support these alternatives that you're articulating?
I think that is an important critique, that how do education alternatives become systemic is a huge question, right? Let's take a little historical walk here for a second. The project of mass education, for instance, in the United States, came out of Horace Mann importing the Prussian system that was based on preparing factory workers, right? It wasn't a project of the state in 1820. It was a project of the state in 1880, and it followed that. So I think my point is that things that start as movements can become systemic. And it's our job to envision the types of movements and alternatives that are going to, for lack of a better word, ensure future generations' capacity for life on the planet. Because that is what the existential stake is right now. Versus reproducing this social order that is the current process of education, right? And so one of our questions is, are our alternatives embedded in capitalism and authoritarianism, or are they embedded in movements for liberation? And TAP deliberately centers pluriversal alternatives rooted in specific histories and struggles, right? So we're getting many different options. There's not one way of doing alternatives. There are many ways of doing it. We need to figure out what they look like in a local context, whether they're aligned to social movements, land rights, labor rights, racial justice, climate justice, and then how can they become progressive alternatives embedded as systemic solutions.
And I guess I would just jump in and add, I think we have to reject these linear notions of progress and institutionalization of these kinds of ideas, right? So, our education systems and structures that have been put into place are a result of different time periods and how it was serving different societal needs over time. And I think what's different now is there's a global agenda. There's much more sharing across the way that technology works, connects people in very different ways. But I think what we're saying is we're at a particular moment where education isn't serving most students that are in the system well, and it's not addressing the issues of the poly crisis. So we're at this juncture where we really need to dramatically change the system that, how education operates. And it's like a chicken and egg thing of, does society change first and then education change, or does education change society? But the point is we've got to do something and agitate, and most change hasn't happened because it's come on down from high with a directive of this is the way things are going to happen. It comes from grassroots movements. It comes from indigenous communities. It comes from people who are saying this isn't working for me and I'm tweaking and learning and coming up with alternatives in a particular context. And I think our point is by learning together and sharing those things, people can see that there are other ways of doing this. I've worked in education reform in this country and around the world for the last 30 years. And I've been in hundreds and hundreds of schools. And, you can't change a school by edict saying this is what you're going to do. It's by showing people and giving people examples and bringing people together where they can kind of think and learn and see that other ways are possible. And it's generative. And I think that's the reason why we put together this volume, and also why TAP exists as a network and as an organization that is spurring these conversations and bringing together people from outside of formal education institutions to share what they're learning and thinking. And I think that's an important part of thinking about the state and education, which is going to push what to change, but it's not a monolith. And I think that's the important piece that we're trying to underscore.
Right. And I guess, who gets to decide if an alternative is actually challenging oppressive structures or just simply being sort of co-opted to support current structures? I think of examples like co-design and the idea of like bringing local communities into the design of different projects and programs, which you hear all the time. I mean, what government nowadays doesn't say they want to do that? Everyone wants to do it. But often they do these consultations and tick box exercises that are so far away from the meaning of co-design, but they use the term and sort of co-opt it without actually giving it any meaning. So in a sense, it's actually just sort of recreating the very structures that are oppressive to begin with, not actually living up to the potential of what, say, co-design could be. So it seems like a very tricky political process and trying to figure out, who gets to even decide if this alternative is actually challenging oppressive structures. How do you see that in the different alternatives that you've looked at around the world?
So, I think what we want to do is center these on when education practices are linked to progressive movements that center on changing or challenging the economic, political, environmental, and cultural structures. And not all do all, together. But I think the idea is that these come together to basically call into question some systems of oppression and try to come up with another pathway around that, right? And in this volume, we have the Goliard chapter that you and I had spoken about before, where education's very much entangled by this modernist, colonial, and progress narrative, and alternatives are new versions of the same logic. That's what this chapter basically argues. But I think the idea that co-optation of these ideas into hegemonic structures is not what we're talking about. We're really saying that this is about fundamentally building a different world and bringing people together to think about concrete ways in their own work to do that. And then by bringing those ideas together, there's a different way of thinking about it. And I think we could look at many of the authoritarian movements that are coming together right right now that are trying to change education very dramatically in an ideological bent too. And that's an alternative and that's a movement, but that is not a progressive movement that's re-envisioning society around regeneration, relationality, around justice, around reparations, or planetary survival. So there's kind of underlying principles, and the top statement lays out many of the core principles that we believe alternatives have to be signaling or moving towards. And it definitely takes into account things that are not about undermining those oppressive structures in society. And I think that's the distinction. A progressive approach to rethinking how society operates is, from a justice perspective, is the underlying piece of that.
Is there any, these non-progressive alternatives, if we can call them that seem to be gaining a lot of ground lately? Is there anything that we could learn from that movement and that sort of set of alternatives that has gained so much traction? Like, is there anything that a progressive alternative movement could learn from that?
Oh, that's an interesting question, Will. I think from my perspective, we can learn from what's animating and motivating people to participate in those movements, right? At some fundamental level, and I've got a student writing about this right now, there's a level of scapegoating going on where people are being blamed for the problems, and it's not actually the groups that are responsible that are being blamed. And what's underneath that appears to be a level of fear about what is happening on the planet and what people's security and their cultural identity or in their economic status is actually going to end up being or be in the near future. And that people are preying on the ways in which the societal issues that we've talked about, right? Going back to neoliberalism and capitalism and these extractive approaches that really end up making life harder for people. And then people are looking for, like, what's the problem? And they're then blaming other groups, and they're being encouraged to blame other groups, right? So how do you make an argument for alternatives that say, hey, we don't have to live in these systems, right? We don't have to work. There's no fundamental law that says capitalism has to be around forever. And B, we don't have to blame other groups. We can actually co-create with other groups. And how do we create our education systems to facilitate that process of collaboration and all the things that we just articulated? This is like the underlying reason for the dialogic education, right? It's not just talking for talk's sake. It's actually so that you can communicate and collaborate and create the society that we all want to, and I would say need to at this point live in.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that one of the main tenets that what we're promoting is to say that when we want to think about education and the purposes of education, it's really to ask people how to question the structures that we live in, to understand those things, but then also come up with ways of living differently, right? And we are in a moment where, as Frank said, we're captured by fear and vulnerability and marginalization. And we're teaching people the solution is to be more competitive and to race ahead of the next person. And I think if we were to imagine a system, an education system that teaches empathy, understanding, compassion, but also to have people learn to problem solve and hear each other better. And we haven't focused on those things. I mean, Frank talked about love, compassion, creativity. Talk to anybody in industry, talk to anybody working in climate, working in almost any field. You want people who can think outside of the box. You want people who can collaborate and show empathy and can try to problem solve from a ground up perspective too. And I think if we were to try to re-envision what education's possibility is, It's to move us away from this idea of rote standardization, competition, and, getting ahead, and building instead systems that are much more equitable so people don't feel so threatened by not being first in the class or not getting the highest number, and kind of moving away from that sense of that's the purpose of education, right? The credential and instrumental role in its relationship with the marketplace. And that's just undermining our social well-being.
So I guess to end, what would be concrete ways forward to sort of enact some of these alternatives, or at least some of the values and ideas behind a lot of the alternatives that you've explored in this special issue? Like, what do we do? How do we move forward?
So the end of this manuscript gets to exactly these issues, where we draw heavily on Michael Apple's tasks for the critical scholar activist in the conclusion of the book. And here we talk about the importance of documenting exploitation and marginalization, naming what is happening, and documenting also progressive struggles and victories, and sharing those stories amongst each other, but also with policymakers and with government officials. We also lay out the idea of identifying these spaces for counter-hegemonic action that are outside of formal schools. Elsewhere, I've written a book with colleagues that look at creating third spaces for post-capitalism, and it's with artists and activists and people in workers' collectives. And so what are those counter-hegemonic spaces that we can learn from and bring into formal schooling? The other point Apple makes is speaking to non-academic audiences. And this was kind of what Frank was just talking about. How do we have people who aren't part of this feel like we're speaking to and with them, right? How do we bring the public in and parents in and community members in to understand that there's other ways of thinking and doing and being? Working with unions and activists and social movements. And there's usually been this divide, right, between workers and academics, and with people in movements and people who are even in unions. So how do we have a more solidaristic communities where we're learning from each other, because there's a lot going on in those spaces. And also confronting these intersections of structures of oppression. Like, how do we really talk about authoritarianism and racism and patriarchy and militarism and all of these things together? They're not separate. They're building one to another. And, what we've seen in things like Project 2025 and what we've seen in many of the policy ideals that have been put forward recently, they're really moving in the opposite direction. So confronting them and talking about how, standardized testing is a disservice for many, many kids, and it's not addressing ESL learners. And it's, there's so many inherent problems in the systems that we've created now, and it's identifying those and writing about them. This all remains essential, but we have to go further than that, and we have to kind of think of new forms of democratic engagement. How do we create more participatory, local to global, pluriversal systems? I mean, I'm a huge Mamdani fan. He just won in New York. And thinking about who he brought together to come to the polls to vote, but not just to vote, to be part of a movement and have conversations about how to change New York and address those issues. It was really inspiring to see who showed up, right? And how he talked to millions and millions of people, focusing all of these things on universal human rights and rights-based approaches, thinking about education, health, water, energy, housing, all as a right and not as a privilege, as a mind shift, right? It's a changing how we talk about these things. This notion of redistribution and dealing with reparations and dealing with tax justice and like global wealth distribution. We've had, I mentioned before, the growing gap between the rich and the poor is absolutely out of control right now. So thinking about policies that prioritize well-being and like things like healthcare for all and different ways that we structure the work week and job opportunities. Again, going back to nature and ecological issues and living very differently on this planet. It's not just recycling. It's really thinking about resources and consumption and use and how we live our daily lives. And I think ultimately, this rejection of violence. I mean, we have such a militaristic the U.S. is a very militaristic society, and we have more guns per capita than anywhere else in the world. And unless we address the kind of ongoing wars, the nuclear threats, and the normalization of everyday violence in society, not going to be able to thrive and function. So it's things like that really require a radical reimagining and rethinking.
We need radical dreaming, right? We've got to build the plane while we're flying it in one generation. And we can do that. And for education, that means preparing our learners for the world that we are in and not some imaginary market. It means transforming education to critical thinking, peace, creativity, love, everything we listed before. And it means recognizing that public goods are human rights. And then at a macro level, we need to think about interspecies governments, our ecological stewardship, reverence for life. And we do touch upon spirituality in the book. And by that, I mean what are we actually doing with our lives? And that is hopefully not just to become the next iteration of consumer, but that there is a deeper meaning and connection with all life on this planet. And I'll end. A decade ago, Steve Cleese leaned over to me, one of the co-authors of this book, and he said, we need a global grassroots movement. And I agree. We need to build solidarity across all of the amazing movements that are represented in the 35 plus chapters in this book. And I'll finally end where Steve often ends, which is recalling Vandana Shiva's words. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing.
Frank Adamson and Anne Spreen, thank you so much for joining FreshEd. Really a pleasure to have you on today, and congratulations on this new book.
Thanks, Will.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having us here, Will.
Frank Adamson is Associate Professor at California State University, Sacramento, and Anne Spreen is a professor at New York University. They've recently co-edited the NORRAG Special Issue entitled Education for Societal Transformation, Alternatives for a Just Future. Please note that opinions expressed on FreshEd are solely those of the host or the guest interviewed, not FreshEd, which takes no institutional position. If you've liked what you've heard today, please rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews really do help. FreshEd's team includes Fatih Akhtas, Obafemi Agunle, Phyllis Che Mensa, and Jose Neto. Original music for FreshEd was created by Digital Primate. FreshEd is an independently run podcast without advertisements and is made possible by the support of the University of Canberra, NORRAG, the Shockdev Family Fund, and listeners like you. Please consider donating to FreshEd by visiting freshedpodcast.com/support. Thanks for listening. I'm Will Brem, and I'll be back next week.